celebrating our 20th season. From the college by the lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest, we are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
We're very happy to welcome you today to a two-part series on the issue of art in America, or really the arts in the world. And we could not be more fortunate to have the two guests that we have for this two-week series to discuss this subject. Not only are they highly informed and have worked in the field of the arts, but they also have a great love for the arts and appreciation, and have given many years to this effort because of their devoted love for the arts. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program. First of all, I'd like to introduce to you, to my far left is Mr. Bob Brown, who is at the present time serving as the chair of the Idaho Arts Commission. He is an attorney in Idaho. He is also a former member of the administration at North Idaho College. And Bob, you have this long history of 20 years of work in the arts here in Idaho, and we're so delighted to have you with us on these two programs.
Thank you, Tony. Good to be back.
And we're so happy to welcome to our state, and Bob Brown deserves a lot of the credit for this gentleman being here today, Mr. Jonathan Kotz, who is now, this time, the Executive Director of the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. In addition to that prestigious position he holds in working with all 50 state art commissions, he is also a former professor of arts administration. In addition to that experience, he served as Executive Director of the Kansas Art Commission for 4 years. He's also been a consultant and advisor to the Ford Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts, among many other things that time will not permit to list on this program. Welcome to our program. We're delighted to have you.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
I would also like to point out to our viewers that on the first program we're going to basically talk about the institutions and organizations serving the arts here in the United States and the state of Idaho, and particularly addressing the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies and the functions and the funding and the purposes. When you join us again next week, we're going to talk about the meaning of art and the issue of censorship and what the arts do for quality of life on part 2. At this time, I'd also like to welcome Janelle Burke, who is one of the regular panelists of this program, and I shall invite Janelle to commence the questioning.
Well, for the benefit of our viewers, let's start immediately by telling them what exactly is the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, or NASA.
It's the collective voice and the service organization for the 56 state and jurisdictional arts agencies. So in addition to the states, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Guam, Northern Marianas, the District of Columbia, and American Samoa have agencies of government that serve the arts, and these agencies utilize NASA as their vehicle for communicating with each other and communicating with the public. And basically we focus on the things that they need to do in common. So that includes arts policy development, where collectively the state arts agencies look at such issues as cultural diversity and arts and education, those things those issues that shape their activities and shape their goals, but that they can't do alone. That they exist in a national economy, a global economy, and they need to work together on those things. So those things we address through arts policy development, and then arts advocacy, in which we deal with affecting the legislative process. And here we're looking at the relationship between Congress and the arts, and the relationship between state governments and the arts, state legislators, governors, and we're the liaison from the state arts agencies to those governmental bodies, and looking at issues like tax legislation that encourages giving in the arts, issues of censorship and freedom of expression, issues of immigration as they affect the arts, postal subsidy, which is very important to all nonprofit groups, and issues like that we identify on a yearly basis. Then also there's the professional development for the people who work for state arts agencies. This is their service organization, and there's several components to this. One group of people are the people who are employed by state arts agencies, and there are perhaps 1,400 of those. And then there are the people who are appointed by either the legislature or the governors in different states, and they are volunteers like Bob Brown, who take on a responsibility as a private citizen, a really important role. We rely in this country on private citizens and volunteers for in areas of health and education and counseling and the arts as well.
And I suppose you do some program development too, or assistance in program development.
More as a clearinghouse than anything else. We really don't work very directly with artists, except as they advise us on the issues that concern them. In other words, we don't do a concert series, but there's very little we do that isn't informed by their advice, because after all, it's important to talk with the people whom you serve, and it's artists, the state arts agencies, and the public at large that we serve.
Now, Bob, exactly how does the Idaho Commission, the Idaho Arts Council, the Idaho Arts Commission fit into this whole picture?
Probably the best way to explain it, Janelle, would be just as we have local arts groups here in, say, Coeur d'Alene, the State Art Commission in Idaho meet. They have one primary difference is on funding, and I'll talk about that later, but we meet and we give technical assistance to local groups from a statewide perspective, and that is precisely what Jonathan and his group does for us from a national perspective. Just as we reach down and help local groups and say, a group in southeast Idaho had your identical problem, and this is what they did. It might be that a group in Coeur d'Alene would never even know that this group in Preston existed. They would have no reason. It might be a dance company who had the same problem as a theater company, and we know that dancers and actors never talk, and so therefore there'd be no way that they would have ever gotten this exchange. So we act as a clearinghouse, we act as a technical assistance agency for these people. We tend to bring people together, and finding that in shared experiences they often will get ideas, get a better way to do something, profit from someone else's mistakes. I just attended in November the national meeting in New York, and it was just incredible to talk to other state chairs and jurisdictional chairs from around the country and this area that we serve through NASA, to talk to them about what do you do. We're all facing, for example, funding problems. Well, for the states that have gone through this, it's nice to say, what did you do when the axe fell? How did your people react? What did you do? Planning, I rely heavily on the material that I receive each month, which is a sizable packet from NASA. It's just extremely interesting material, which I try to share not only with the State Art Commission, but with people here in town. But we find that the services provided by NASA are a tremendous assistance to our State Art Commission. And there are many things that happen on the eastern coast, for example, that seem to have little applicability to Idaho, but there are and some things we just can't use. We don't have all of the resources that New York City has. We don't have all of the cultural diversity in Idaho that they might have, say, in the Bay Area or Los Angeles, California. But still, there are many, many things that come across my desk and across the desk of our Idaho Art Commission that we use in the day-to-day lives of the Idaho citizens.
I want to get into some follow-up questions on the organization. And Jonathan, when you opened up the program, you did a very fine job of explaining geographically the service area. But I know we have viewers that would be wondering about whether you're private or government or semi-government and private. Would you take us a little bit through the governing system of your organization, board of directors, and how you choose the policymakers?
Sure. We're a 501c3, a nonprofit tax-exempt service organization. And there are about 5,000 organizations like that in Washington, D.C., each serving a group of professionals who communicate through their service organization. I have a staff of 12, including a lobbyist. And 1/3 of my staff resources are devoted to gathering information. I have 3 staff people who gather information on the uses of public funds in supporting the arts, because state arts agencies are responsible not only for what they get from the legislature, but for congressional funds that they get through the National Endowment for the Arts, they get a portion of that federal agency's budget. And so it's very important to relay back to the federal government and to relay the big picture back to the state government decision makers. What is the effect of these funds? In what way are they going out to individuals, to organizations, for presenting and touring, for education, in the different art forms? Are they going to rural, urban?
So you keep a lot of statistics on reporting that. But you have a board.
Right, that's right.
That's
okay,
a private, non-profit corporation.
Right. And my board is 15 people and 3 optional positions that exist at the pleasure of the chair of the board. We have a nominating committee that brings names forward, and those are usually executive directors or chairs of state arts agencies. That's the 15. The other 3 are typically not state arts agency employees. They may be somebody who works for a regional arts organization like the Western States Arts Foundation, which the Idaho Commission on the Arts belongs to, or a funder of the arts, or a corporate public relations person, somebody whose expertise can advise us in addressing the issues.
And how long are the terms?
They're staggered 3-year terms, okay. So that in a given year there's rotation of 1/3 of the board.
Okay, and I want to relate that to a comparison with the National Endowment of the Arts. Since I know I am president of a 501c3 organization right now, and we have a lot of independence, a lot of decision making. There are some restrictions, but they're not a long list of restrictions. But explain to us and to our viewers then how the National Endowment would be different from yours, and that receives a lot more of attention about public policy and political issues.
Sure. My relationship with my board, by the way, is I work for them.
Yes.
They hire me and they can fire me. And the role of the chair of NASA, who is usually either a state agency executive director or the chair of a state agency, is a very important one. So my title is executive director, but I implement their policy and advise them on that. At the National Endowment for the Arts, the chair of the National Endowment for the Arts is an unusual position even within the federal government. That person is the chair of the National Council, which is an advisory group of 26 people appointed directly by the president.
So it's very much an integral part of government in that sense. That's
right, and that person is the chair of that board. In other words, the authorizing officer. Now that's a grant-making agency. We don't make grants. Mm-hmm. We will sometimes contract for services if we want somebody to do a study or some research for us or conduct a workshop. But that's a grant-making agency. And they, unless the chairman of the endowment signs that grant, it's not authorized. In other words, his board does not have the authority to do that. He is also the chief of staff. So that person is essentially the president of the board and the head of staff, structurally, a very powerful person.
So when we get into debates, which we'll talk about that in the next show, about censorship and so forth. So in that particular organization, if a grant was being awarded that became controversial, there's a lot more political pressure that can be applied or can be affected in that system than what you're working with.
Well, I think that's correct, and for a couple of different reasons. I should mention that the amounts of money that we represent are comparable.
Is that correct?
The National Endowment for the Arts budget is $175 million, $175.9 million this fiscal year. Now the state arts agencies represent this year about $215 million.
So your budget's a little bit larger.
Well, the budgets of the agencies.
Yes, that's what I'm speaking of.
So in policy development, we work as partners, though NASA itself is not a grant-making agency. Okay. Now, I should respond also to your question about the political response to what the endowment does. At the state level, for someone to raise funds by attacking the arts, it's not a very large scope. Whereas if you raise funds by presenting yourself as defending the public's interest in morality and family values at the national level, you have a very large clientele that can send you money. And maybe that's a subject for our other show.
For the next show. I want to ask Bob Brown before we go back to Chanel's question. In the budget areas, you've articulated very, very well the structure. Now, if we move back into the organization that Jonathan heads nationally, and Bob is chair of the commission in the state of Idaho, I would assume that each state has some similar ways of getting their funds. But anyway, in the case of Idaho, where does your funds come from?
We have three sources of funds. We have direct money from the National Endowment for the Arts, which is a state basic grant, and some grants from the National Endowment. That money flows in directly to us with certain restrictions, some without any restrictions. But that money is used many times in program areas specified by the National Endowment. Then the state legislature will each year in their state budget allocate funds for the State Art Commission. Now, those two are the two largest, and they're just about equal right now in Idaho. And we've had an increase in state funding. I believe you mentioned in your speech today about 12% from the legislature. The legislative portion of our funding has gone up over the last 5 years. It used to be quite low, and as more and more demands were made upon us in terms of arts group and the awareness of art in Idaho, there has been a lot of pressure on the legislature to increase this funding, and they responded. And we've fortunately had good times as well, and so our funding comes primarily from those two sources, and a third source would be private grants or private funds for special projects.
And then you have a number of commissioners that allocate those funds in the different areas of the arts as requested. But then both you as chair and other members of the commission, how are you placed on that commission?
Okay, unlike John Fulmeyer as chair of the Idaho Art Commission, I hardly even get a vote. I only vote in case of a tie, and on a 13-member commission, that doesn't come up real often. But the money that is dispensed through the State Art Commission is done on paneling by experts for like the different fellowships and awards that are given. There is a grants committee of our commission that meets, and we receive many, as I'm sure you could imagine, thousands of dollars of requests, more than we have money. Each year, the most difficult meeting we have is dealing with the great need that seems to be out there from arts groups in Idaho that we are not able to fully fund. And so we must look at each project and try to be as judicious as we can in spreading the money that we have out to the arts groups.
But that commission that makes the final decision, are all the members appointed by the governor?
Yes, I'm sorry, that was
yes.
the other part of your question. The governor appoints all 13 commissioners directly and also appoints the chair and the vice chair.
Sure. Janelle Burke.
Well, let's get into a little bit now exactly what are those arts and what art forms are you talking about? I'm not talking about does this person think this is art or do they think it's garbage, but we're talking about now what art forms are we talking about? Are we talking about music? Are we talking about visual art? Are we talking about humanities? What are we talking about?
Each state in authorizing its state arts agency identifies the arts that it looks to the agency to provide leadership in and support for. Typically, they're the performing arts, dance, drama, and music, and the visual arts, and which might include cinema, media, and literary arts, and it's difficult to just make distinctions sometimes. Now, many of the state arts agencies support also botanic gardens, zoos, so they may fit in there also. What a state defines as its culture is different from state to state. Some include festivals and aesthetics and criticism. Others don't. Sometimes there's overlap between the arts and the humanities. And the National Endowment for the Arts has a definition in its legislation also.
Well, that's a very interesting area, and when we get into talking about what is art, are these various states free then to perhaps focus on what is unique to their particular state? And can you talk about that a little bit? Because
yes,
it seems to me like this would be a great way to keep some of the flavor that you find in, for example, the Southwest as opposed to the Northeast.
We might talk a bit about the relationship between the National Endowment for the Arts and the state arts agencies, which is largely mediated through this organization, through NASA. the money that comes from the endowment, one of the sources of it comes in a block grant to state arts agencies, and there's a set amount for each state, and then it's adjusted for population. Now, the requirements that a state has to meet to get those funds include a planning process that is acceptable to the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. And a component of that planning, it must be inclusive, it must be consultative with constituent groups in the state. It's usually advised by panels, as a peer panel process, but stipulated in the legislation is that there be a public hearing process. And so that whatever else there is, there must be a public hearing process that goes into this planning. And when the endowment looks at money going to state arts agencies, it makes a decision on whether it's going to give it to the state on a 1-year, 2-year, or 3-year basis. So the state arts agencies try to give as much confidence in that planning process as they can, so that they don't have to go back to scratch to explain what they do every single year when they're considered for those funds.
Okay, and I'm going to come back to you in just a minute and ask you what are some of the examples of art forms that
Sure.
are peculiar to an individual area. I'm going to ask Bob first, what has Idaho done, some of the Idaho programs that are specific, but then we'll come back
Sure.
to you and you can compare some of the other states, the interesting, innovative programs.
Well, first of all, on the listings that Jonathan gave in terms of performing arts, visual arts, we have all of those in our plan. We also have one that many states have, and that is folk art. And our folk art program, Robert McCarl is in charge of that, and that he goes to the Mexican Hispanic community in southwest Idaho. He goes to the Native American, all the tribes. He's gotten a tremendous program of the 5 tribes in Idaho together on retaining their native skills and so forth in certain areas. He deals with cowboy poets. He deals with the Basque dancers. We have a tremendously rich cultural diversity in Idaho in terms of impact, but not of numbers. That is to say, we have very small populations in most of these areas, but we consider to be one of the real strengths of the state is what they were here and have been here for so long. And so we spend a lot of emphasis on the folk arts, and that's our, if you will, contribution to capturing the flavor of what is Idaho and incorporating it in our programs. I'm at the second half of your comment about the, well, you want to go to Jonathan first and then come back to me, so we'll go ahead.
Okay. Let's go to Jonathan and find out about some other states, what they've done that are uniquely and peculiarly them.
Sure, and it's a good question, especially to somebody representing the state arts agencies, because we always advocate that decisions should be made where they can be made most knowledgeably, to provide the best public benefit. And there are certain kinds of decisions that are really appropriate to be made at the state level, because people like Bob Brown know what's going on in Idaho, and a federal person might not know as much, and a local person might not have the as broad a perspective. So I can mention, for instance, in Hawaii, that because of the mix of cultures there, that state arts agency will support and preserve such arts as hula, the making of leis,
Yes.
Various festivals and competitions that come out of the Chinese culture, the Japanese culture, and the native Hawaiian culture, that just wouldn't have those same forms in another state, and it would be difficult elsewhere to say this is a good example of that, and this is not such a good example of that. But the people in the state of Hawaii are best positioned to make those judgments. In Minnesota, the State Arts Agency has taken an initiative to develop a network for a marketplace for crafts. Now, when you think about individual artists, it's a real challenge to assist in their development of their marketplace. Visual artists, writers, craftspeople, they exist in a national economy, but it's very difficult for them to have access to it. And it can be very expensive, and they can spend half of their time doing that. One of the things that the state arts agencies did in Minnesota was to act as a sponsoring agency for the American Crafts Enterprise crafts show. which benefited hundreds of craftspersons and produced a marketplace for crafts and really helped the local Minnesota people access a market there. In the Virgin Islands, a similar kind of project helped visual artists, because it's very difficult for somebody in an island community like that to access a New York market. And what the state agency there did was act as a liaison between a gallery owner in New York, and they produced a juried show in St. Thomas, and then the works went there. I could mention the North Carolina Arts Council in a number of states where they may not have as large major institutions. They may not have a large and big budget symphony or large and big budget theater. A state will invest in local arts agencies, and North Carolina is known for the network of local arts agencies that has been largely assisted by the state arts agency.
I would like to talk a little bit about something that I saw in the literature, although we have been certainly addressing that in an indirect way. Both your organization and the National Endowment of the Arts create what we call policies. And could you take us a little bit through, Jonathan, what are some of the major components in both your organization and NEA concerning the kind of policies that you are responsible for working on or setting?
Well, some of the policies have to do with how we work together in the public sector. How does the National Endowment for the Arts make a decision about a program? If the endowment wants to affect arts education in this country, what does it do? And so we try to assist in that policy making and say, here's what the state arts, here's a forum for our discussion. When you want to do something like that, we're happy to survey our membership, find out what's going on there, find a spokesperson, knowledgeable people, so we can sit down and develop a program that we can contribute resources to, that you can contribute resources to. Your guidelines don't take away decision making that should be made at the state level. At the same time, you're in a position to make sure that our planning is fair and give the oversight that Congress would want. And here's how we can involve the communities of artists, the communities of presenters, the theater people, the symphony, that kind of setting up the planning process for affecting, let's say, how do you create a national network that can promote the booking of dance? I mentioned that because it's specifically a project that we work on with the National Endowment for the Arts and regional arts organizations in the dance community. So there's now something called Dance on Tour that we all contribute resources to. That's one kind of issue. Another kind of issue has to do with identifying a certain goal. We want to promote arts education, let's say, or we want to promote cultural diversity. How do we do that together? What tools do the people in the field need? How can we assist artists? How can we assist local funders? How can we assist concert people?
At that point, I have to interrupt. We're
Sure.
out of time, but the good news for our viewers is that we will be back next week with our two guests, and at that time we will continue to discuss arts in America, and we're going to get into some very substantive issues of what is art and the controversy of censorship of art, and I know both our guests will be delighted to discuss that subject with you, and we will give some examples of controversy in the past in the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you've enjoyed our program, and I'd like to invite you again to be with us at this time next week when as I said, we will have part 2. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station. Celebrating our 20th season. From the College by the Lake, meeting the personalities and discussing the issues that affect all of Coeur d'Alene and the inland Northwest. We are the North Idaho College Public Forum. And now, here's your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I wish to welcome back all our viewers from last week when we told you at that time we would do part 2 of this 2-week series entitled Arts in America. Our two guests have returned. We're very delighted to have them back. It was a very stimulating conversation last week when we talked particularly about the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, and we also discussed the National Endowment for the Arts, and particularly how the first organization works with and is really the national organization for the state commissions on the arts. And we talked about policy and funding. It is our purpose on this program number 2 to emphasize the freedom of art and the issue of censorship, looking at that from a national perspective and looking at some examples around the country. Gentlemen, welcome back. I would first introduce to you Mr. Bob Brown, who is at the present time the chair of the Idaho Commission on the Arts. In addition to that position, which is voluntary, he is an attorney in the state of Idaho and a former administrator at North Idaho College. Bob, it was a pleasure having you here last week, and welcome back.
Thank you, Tony.
I'm also equally happy to have on our program Jonathan Kotz, who comes to us from their national office, and he is the executive director of the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. He has many years' experience in this field, including serving as a professor of arts administration. He is the former executive director of the Kansas Arts Commission, and he has also been a consultant and advisor to the Ford Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. If I may call you Jonathan.
Please do.
Welcome back once again. We're delighted to have you here.
Thanks.
And as always, we're so pleased to have Janelle Burke as a regular panelist, and I shall ask her to commence the questioning.
Just to review briefly for our viewers, can you tell us again, Jonathan, exactly what is the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies?
It's the collective voice and service organization for the 56 state and jurisdictional arts agencies, and it assists them in developing arts policies, in advocacy, and in leadership development.
Now, Bob, you're the president of the chairman of the Idaho Commission on the Arts, and can you tell us how you fit then into this organization and other national organizations?
We are a member of the NASA, the National Assembly. We get a lot of technical assistance from them. We set their policy in that we get together either through the board that we've elected or at our national meetings, and we say, this is the policy of the National Assembly, and then Jonathan and his staff carries that out. The other component is the National Endowment for the Arts, and that is a national group composed of the National Council for the Arts appointed by the President. And I might just mention that we're very fortunate in Idaho, I think for the first time in our history, if I'm not mistaken, to have a representative on the National Council, Louise McClure, the wife of former U.S. Senator Jim McClure, serves now on that council, and I understand from talking to people this morning, as a matter of fact, at a meeting that she's just doing a fantastic job. So we're really pleased to have her there.
Now, Jonathan, coming back to you, let's talk a little bit now in our subject today about what is art and some of the freedom of expression that art represents. What is art? Isn't beauty in the eye of the beholder? And how do you define that?
Well, beauty probably is in the eye of the beholder, and I guess one way to respond is that art is more than beauty. That art is a kind of experience, that it is an interrelation between a perceiver and the object that has been created, and that it includes community experience, festivals, the performing, visual, literary arts, and I think that we see many issues growing out of the very complex nature of art. It is expression, it's communication, it is a combined experience. You know, just think of the Greek symbol for it, and you see the happy mask and the sad mask. It has to do with putting on the skins of others and seeing life through their eyes. So it's hard to nail down in a definition. I would call it a language of experience.
And then it must be very difficult to try and have a group making this purchase. In other words, we're making a purchase or we're investing in an art form for a number of people, not just one person. It's hard enough for me to decide on my own. How about when we're trying to decide for many people? So how do you suggest that we go about this, making this group decision?
Well, almost anything is difficult in a democracy. Nobody ever argued that it was the easiest system or the least expensive. But what it does try to do is to provide involvement. And I think Bob could talk about how the Idaho Commission goes about trying to ensure that its citizens and its arts community are represented in the funding decisions that Idaho makes.
Bob, would you tell us about that?
We go through a planning process in which we go around the state and have community meetings that are well advertised. We had one this spring, a series of 45 meetings throughout the state of Idaho, and they were well attended, much higher attendance than anyone had anticipated. We had, for example, almost 45 people at the Coeur d'Alene evening meeting, and Margot Knight, the executive director, and I simply sat and listened, and we took notes and had a tape recording of what people told us they wanted the state art agency to do. And they told us about not only funding requests, but policy and how they perceived us and how they perceived art in Idaho. And adding just very briefly what Jonathan said about beauty and art being the eyes of the beholder, you know, there's a very popular misconception that art is beautiful. And you know, you have the Shakespeare sonnet, which you read, and many people can agree that that's a beautiful thing to listen to, but it's just as artistic when an angry young man from Vietnam, feeling betrayed by his country, has a poem that is just powerfully written, saying what happened to him or what had gone wrong with his life. That is art. There is no question that art is not easy to listen to. It is not beautiful. Or a sculpture, you know, the David is a beautiful piece of sculpture. I think everyone could agree. But then when you go to the Vietnam Memorial, I'm using that same again, there's hardly a more powerful sculpture, and I've not seen it yet, but everyone I've talked to said that is one of the most powerful sculptures they've ever seen, and but it's not beautiful. And
there was a great deal of controversy involved in that, as well as in many other things. So what I hear Bob saying, sort of, is I may not like it, but it might be good for me. How about that, Jonathan?
Well, I think it might be useful to look at the function of art in a democracy. You know, people, the democracy isn't an easy system to be a participant in. You have to do a couple of things. One of them is make choices. Another one is see things from another person's point of view. Those are things that are learned well through the arts, and learning drama, and understanding the art of other cultures, as well as one's own, are really important in the kinds of decisions that we have to make as citizens. I have to say that a really important thing about democracy is for us to remember that voting alone and the system of democracy can result in a tyranny of the majority. What is the most essential feature of a democracy is freedom, and that has to do with allowing all voices to be heard, and the arts sensitize us to that, and teach us to see things from other points of view as well.
This certainly has built the bridge for me. I want to talk about the issues we said of freedom and censorship, and I'm going to play the role at this point of a critic. Some of the criticisms that you would have experienced in your work and others that are in the arts. The question that you often hear, and I shall pose that question to you now, is with all the problems that there are in society and all the demand there are for the funds that we have and deficit and so forth, how does one justify to the average woman or man on the street using both federal and state funds for the arts? I know you get that question a lot, and how would you address that? Jonathan, we'll start with you at the national level, and I'll ask Bob to deal with it at the state level.
That I think by responding that there are many things that government has to do, and it draws upon different amounts of resources to do them. I think everybody understands that in tough times you withdraw funding from everything, and you have to decide what's valuable and what's not. I think that the values to a democracy of art are what we come back to. That the language of the National Endowment for the Arts authorization, why Congress created it, said that it's important in a democracy for its citizens not to be the unthinking servants of technology. It's important for us to understand each other's heritages and beliefs, because we can't have a democracy without those things. And so I think that's one response.
Okay. Bob?
Frequently you hear about people who don't have children, who don't understand why they have to pay taxes for schools. They have received their schooling, they're now tax-paying citizens, And they say, well, I don't need to support the schools. Why don't the people who have kids support the schools? To me, that is similar to the situation with art. People who say, I never go to plays, I don't go to the theater, I don't go to symphonies, I don't want my tax dollars spent for those people who do. I think that there's a myopic vision there of the lack of just the humanity that art provides, of the spirit for people and the quality of life. And I think that time and time again it's been shown that there's an enrichment of the civilization when the civilization permits art to flourish. And I think one of the ways that we have encouraged art to flourish is through some public funding. There are those who say it's too much. There are those like myself who think that it's too little. And that again is the democracy. And I guess that in the tugs and pulls of funding problems, I would not say fund art and let the schools go down the drain. I would say, however, that when you look at the whole picture, all of these things are components of our civilization, and maybe funding could be reduced in a balanced way. Too often, we're faced with those problems where we say, well, art is a frill, and we can't afford frills this year, and so we're going to cut art out. And I just don't think art could ever be considered a frill. I think art is a necessity, and to what extent it's funded will always be that balance.
May I have a comment?
Sure.
A little money goes a long way in the arts. You can throw $1 million at roads and highways, or $1 million at other kinds of enterprises, even hospitals, and you look at what have you gotten for your $1 million. You throw $1 million at the arts, and you can change community life in the state. You can give people activities that won't otherwise be available to them and their children. I mean, you can make them want to live where they live, and you can give them the acknowledgement that government is doing a good job for them. And that's a very small expenditure in the public sector can result in that, and it takes very large expenditures in other areas to have any impact on people's lives.
I have a second question, and then I'll go back to our panel member. Again, the critics coming forward to your organizations and others and saying, well, they look at the awarding of grants for certain artists to do particular things, and in doing that they become offended. That is, that they find that the particular work that is produced is offensive to some segments of our society, and they judge it as being immoral, obscene, and therefore, oftentimes they say two things. One, they don't want government dollars involved, but sometimes they also take the next step and say it shouldn't be allowed in society at all. And in answering that question, Jonathan, I would first just quote something I found that you said, and you said an idea or image that one person or group finds unfamiliar, interesting, routine, or challenging can always be found objectionable or offensive by another person or group. How do you answer the critics that ask that particular question?
Well, I think one response is whose judgment is more valid in determining what people get a chance to see, what ideas people get a chance to think. We have a commitment in this society towards the broad marketplace of ideas and images. And that means that you fund a range of things, and anybody can choose to be offended by something, but you can't let somebody who's offended determine that other citizens, their neighbors, can't see these things. And very often, funding makes a difference between having access to the ideas and being able to see these things and knowing that they're going on. It's part of public education. And so it really is an access issue. Most people, and I think we see this increasingly in politics, will come down on the side of choice. I don't want my legislators to make this decision for me. I don't want my neighbor to make this decision for me. I want to have the option to see things and to experience them and make the decision for myself.
Bob?
I think this may be begging the question a little bit, but I think it's important to keep in mind that of all the projects funded by the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, you're really talking about like less than 0.1% of the total funding for the whole history of the NEA that has caused any difficulty. Now, if you take that same formula and apply it to baseball, you've got Hall of Famers that would not come close. You could apply that kind of percentage to virtually a test that you would give in your political science class to any part of our life, and we'd say that is fantastic. That's 99 point something percent, and what could be better than that? And I think that's important to remember that it takes only one or two Serranos or Mapplethorpe that cause the difficulty. And in reality, we're talking about literally thousands and thousands of projects that have been funded that have brought joy and happiness to people all across the United States.
I guess I just have to have a follow-up question. You triggered it, Bob. Let us suppose that the censorship is successful in that 1/10 of 1% or whatever it might be. There is such a battle, as Jonathan has said, between individuals about whether they will or will not allow someone else to determine for them what to see or read and so forth. If those particular examples you gave, Bob, were successful, would it possibly lead to encouragement to censor a larger percentage?
Well, I certainly feel that way. I feel like that anytime, whether you see it in library censorship, with books, with ideas, on television, with art, whatever you're talking about, when you talk about censorship, it feeds upon itself. And if you have a group that is successful, let's just say that the four of us could agree that a particular piece of art was absolutely obscene, that there was no justifiable reason for its existence, and we agreed to burn it. Well, if we four did this, then there'd be a group who would say, well, they didn't think this was, but I did, and they were successful, and so we think that this one, and it would simply, like dominoes, as you see on the television ad, I'm convinced that you would simply encourage this idea that things can be censored, and Jonathan has said it so well that in our pluralistic society, we're all very reluctant to say, who is going to decide for me what I'm going to read, what I'm going to see, and what I'm going to think? And I think that's the danger.
Janelle, excuse me, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, our history as a people in this country is that we don't want a state culture. We don't really have a state theater. We don't want government putting its imprimatur on a kind of art. We want to see the broad range of things. We've seen what happens when a government does that. We saw what happened when the Third Reich did that, and we saw that the narrowing of opinions that can be expressed is then applied to this particular art, this particular art, this particular art, and then whatever government supports becomes official. And we've avoided that. It's been our history and our dedication in our system to avoid that. It was 5 years from the burning of books to the burning of people. And that's a lesson that has to be learned.
Janelle Burke.
It's very interesting to talk about that particular concept. Isn't part of the whole issue in the selection process, and I'm not talking now so much about the procedure that we're going to go through to select, but rather what do we look at, or what determines how we select what we're going to invest in?
That's a very complex question. I think you're right to hit upon it as worthy of public discussion. I think it's important that certain viewpoints not be perpetuated by the system that we choose. For instance, it's important to avoid what the legal term is viewpoint discrimination. Mm-hmm. When the decision makers say, "We'll fund this kind of art over a period of time," if that doesn't allow for other kinds of art and other ideas to surface and be discussed and get public viewing, we would call that viewpoint discrimination, and that's one reason why we have equal time on television and on the media. So the state arts agencies, for instance, have systems, and Bob can describe Idaho's, that try to ensure that the process involves a broad range of input in making those decisions, and there's turnover in the people who do it. But generally there are two principles that you look for, and one is public involvement, and another one is peer review.
Okay, and when you're looking for this particular piece of art, or there's going to be a project of some particular kind, what beside diversity do you think is important? Diversity of idea. Do you think that the content is important? Do you think that the way it's done is important? That it be something that has a lasting value? I mean, what other kinds of things do you look for?
Well, I think there's a great deal of subjectivity involved. I don't think we can ever say that the panel made an objective decision. It's made up of people, and it's important that everybody
recognize that.
Well, I don't think so. I think people attack the public decision-making process, and they say, "Well, this is what 10 people think." And I think a response has to be, "That's right. This is what 10 people think, and next year it'll be a different 10 people." And we try to select these 10 people because they represent a broad range of opinions and different groups in the population, and we rotate them, and that's how we work in a democratic system. We don't have a czar. We don't have a commissar who makes a decision and says this is what the art is going to be. We don't let the state do it. We don't let very respected. We don't let colleges do it. We don't let church representatives do it.
Okay, now, Bob, Jonathan alluded a little earlier to the fact that you could explain a little bit maybe how Idaho has worked through some of these problems of selection, but I also want to ask you, as a part of that question, if you would address, sometimes we think it's them and us, it's the artists versus us, but in fact, how does the controversy manifest itself? Do all artists always agree that...
Certainly
not.
The artists, of course, are just like any other segment of our society. They have a wide range of opinion on. There are many artists, for example, who don't believe in public funding for the arts for a totally different reason. There are artists who would love to have more funding for the arts directed to them in particular. So they have a wide range. The artists themselves, I don't think you can, there's no particular belief that I think you can subscribe to any group of artists out there. In Idaho, we work very closely with the artists, and we've certainly encountered a wide divergence of opinion on public funding of art and the process. Now, the process in Idaho, which is, I think, quite similar to most states, we have panels. We have wide distribution of information about funding for, let's say, a fellowship in writing, or for a visual arts, or for a performing arts roster, a touring roster. That is disseminated as widely as we can to get the highest number of people to participate in that initial application process. Then we bring in a panel of experts in that area, with, let's just say, music. I recently served on the WestF, non-classical music panel, and I was a non-voting member, just sort of an air traffic controller who sort of kept things going. But I had very good experience of listening to these people who really knew about jazz and folk music, talk about this, and talk about the good and the bad. And they selected a touring roster for WestF. It's exactly the same as we do in Idaho. A panel selects, I should say nominates, really, because I'm going to get into that in just a moment. A panel nominates a list of projects to be funded, or winners in a particular contest. Then that is given to the State Arts Commission, and we approve or disapprove. So there really is a double layer. The panel suggests that in their artistic expertise, these are the best music people, the best drama people, whatever it may be, and that they recommend funding. And then we look at it, and when we look at it trying to keep in mind that we ask the panel to give us their artistic opinion. There may be geographic considerations, or something where we just think that even though the panel thought this was the very good thing to do, we're not so sure that in Idaho that would be a program that would have wide appeal. And we might go against the panel and not fund something that they recommended if there were other considerations that beyond artistic. Now, we try to avoid doing that simply because we have asked the panel to give their time and expertise to help us out. But there is that public element all the way through, from the very beginning of the advertising to the final selection, where those are funded.
May I talk a bit about controversial art?
Yes.
I think that one of the reasons why we talk so much about it and people get so exercised about it is because arts education in our country is so inadequate and so haphazard. I think that if we put more resources into it and people knew the many things that art does, represents the world as beautiful, represents the world as challenging, represents the drama in our lives and the difficult decisions we have to make, helps us see our way through these things, and sometimes we need to be confronted by things that we're unfamiliar with, values that we disagree with, in order to learn and grow and understand how other people work and understand why our society is changing the way it is. And clarify our ideas about ourselves. Well, that's not always pleasant. It's not always comfortable. But I don't know that being offended by it is the appropriate reaction to it. And that's something we ought to learn in school. We ought to learn in school that art expands our experience and that it helps us question ourselves, and that's how you use it. And I think that one of the reasons we have controversy about this is because we're just not familiar with how healthy this process is, both for ourselves as individuals and for our society as a whole.
Along that line, you again triggered a question, as Bob had earlier. I have, in political science, have studied the history of countries, and I have visited the Soviet Union twice before the collapse of the totalitarian system, and you really get a real vivid picture of what a democracy is here compared with the totalitarian system. And both under Hitler in Germany and under Stalin and even other leaders after him, art became very political, and only certain things could be brought forth, both in paintings and writings and so forth. When that happens, my question is a rather philosophical one. Do you suppose that because of that censorship for that long period of time, particularly in the Soviet Union, and certain artists were not allowed to do certain things, and some of them, actually heeded that restriction and did not do it, in those times are great artworks lost to humanity?
Yes, I think so. I heard an anecdote recently where somebody described the repression of religion in the Soviet Union as hitting a nail with a hammer, that the harder you hit it, the deeper you drive it in. And I think art is like that too. When people are under stress, they continue to have the need to express themselves, and it often results in a very powerful kind of art. People have to take great risks to do it. And I think we tend to take so much for granted in our country that we don't realize that Mstislav Rostropovich, who is the conductor of the Washington Symphony, had to smuggle works of art out of the country because they were not of the approved kind of music that the government wanted to hear. So yeah, I'm not suggesting that artists have to work in a garret. I think people produce good work when they're happy and healthy and have money and food on the table. But I should mention also that I just had a conversation just a few months ago with Minister Gulbenko of then the Soviet Union. And he is an artist himself, he's an actor. And what he was talking about in the Soviet Union was the fact that there was that the tradition of honoring the art of the different peoples had been lost because there were the schools hadn't maintained them, and they hadn't made the kind of investment that he sees us doing here.
Thank you. On that note, we have to conclude this 2-week series. On behalf of Janelle Burke and our staff, thank both of you gentlemen. It's been most informative and exciting to have you on our program again. Many thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, we've had a 2-week series on art. I'm sure you have found it most informative, and I would like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time when we shall discuss what we believe to be an important issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.